The wind whistled across the barren prairie, dry grass bowing low as if it feared the weight of the endless sky. Jacob Holt, a man of 35 with eyes the color of ash and a silence that made neighbors uneasy, stood at the edge of his ranch and stared at the crooked fence line. He was known in town as the Lonely Rancher, not because he lacked land or cattle, but because he had never known the warmth of a woman's steady presence at his hearth. People whispered about him in the saloon, said he had a heart colder than a Wyoming winter, said he cared more for the stubborn mules he bred than for any living soul. Yet it was not bitterness that carved lines into his face, but solitude. His parents were gone, claimed by fever years earlier, and his younger brother lay 6 feet under after a shootout with drifters. Jacob's days were long stretches of work and silence, his nights even longer, haunted by the creak of the empty rocking chair by the fire. One evening, after selling a load of hay in town, Jacob sat at a poker table in the Blackthorn saloon. Men drank hard, laughed harder, and filled the smoky air with boasts and challenges. Whiskey loosened tongues, and it was there, amid the rattle of dice and the shuffle of cards, that the reckless bet was born. Holt, called Ezra Clanton, a ranch hand with a cruel streak. "You're so cold a woman couldn't thaw you out if she tried. I'll wager $50 you ain't man enough to marry before the month is out." The men around the table howled, pounding their mugs against the scarred wood. Jacob looked up slowly, his jaw hard. "50 won't buy a cow," he said flatly. "Then make it 100, Ezra spat, his grin wide. "And here's the sweet of it, don't just marry any skirt. Marry that plump widow who came in last week on the stagecoach, the one too soft for ranch life, too spoiled by biscuits and pies. What's her name?" "Mary Ellen Carter," someone supplied. The men roared again, mocking the young widow whose curves had drawn cruel jests since she stepped foot in Blackthorn. She was scarcely 23, her husband buried back east, her cheeks round and ruddy, her figure full. She had come west to escape whispers of failure and pity, yet the frontier offered no gentler tongue. Jacob's eyes narrowed. The bet was foolish, mean-spirited, and beneath him, yet something inside him tightened at the mention of the widow's name. He remembered seeing her climb from the coach, her dress too fine for the dusty street, her gaze proud though her hands trembled. He remembered the loneliness in her eyes, a loneliness that matched his own. Without a smile, without even a flicker of humor, Jacob laid his cards down. 100 it is, he said. The saloon went silent for a breath, then erupted with jeers and laughter. The wager was sealed. By the rules of men too proud to step back from a dare, Jacob Holt would marry the widow Mary Ellen before the month turned. Mary Ellen had not expected to be anyone's bet. She had lost her husband to a sudden illness, endured the endless condolences of relatives, and packed what little she owned to seek a new life in the West. She dreamed of open skies and honest work, perhaps teaching at the small schoolhouse, perhaps baking bread for miners. What she had not dreamed of was ridicule. In the market she heard women whisper about her size, heard boys snicker, saw the smirks of cowhands. She forced her chin high and pretended not to notice, but each word stung like a burr under the skin. At night in her small rented room, she pressed her face into her pillow and wondered if she had been a fool to come west at all. When Jacob Holt came knocking on her door, his hat in hand, she thought it a cruel trick of fate. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low, "I'd like to speak with you." She studied him, wary. His shoulders filled the doorway, his expression unreadable. "About what?" He hesitated, then told her. Not about the bet. He could not bring himself to admit that. But about his need for a wife on the ranch. He spoke of long winters, of cattle drives, of the emptiness of a house with no laughter. He spoke not like a suitor, but like a man offering a bargain. She would have security, food, a home. He would have companionship. Mary Ellen's heart thudded. No one had spoken to her so directly before. Not even her late husband. She should have been offended by the bluntness, but there was something steady in Jacob's tone, something that sounded like truth. Still, doubt gnawed. Was she so unwanted that a man she hardly knew could appear at her door and propose such a thing? Was she desperate enough to accept? Yet when she looked into Jacob Holt's gray eyes, she saw not mockery but an aching loneliness that mirrored her own. "I'll think on it," she whispered. The town buzzed with rumors as days passed. Wagers exchanged hands. Some said Mary Ellen would never accept, that she had too much pride. Others said she would leap at the chance, that no woman of her shape and sorrow could expect better. Jacob waited in silence, fixing his fence lines, hauling water, But his thoughts never strayed far from the widow. He had not told her of the bet. Shame coiled in his gut each time he remembered the laughter in the saloon, but perhaps, he told himself, what began as a wager could end as something real. On the 7th evening, Mary Ellen knocked on his door. The sunset spilled gold across the prairie and her shadow stretched long. Jacob opened the door, his chest tightening. "Mr. Holt," she said softly, "I'll be your wife, but not for charity, not for pity. If I come here, I come as your equal, not your burden." Jacob inclined his head. "Then equal you'll be." And so the lonely rancher and the young widow were wed, not in a church filled with roses, but in the courthouse with only the clerk as witness. There were no vows of passion, only the exchange of rings and the solemn nod of a man and woman who had chosen not to walk the frontier alone. But the frontier was not gentle, and the night of their marriage held more than either had bargained for. On their wedding night, the wind rose wild, rattling shutters and carrying the howl of coyotes across the land. Jacob stoked the fire, uncertain, while Mary Ellen stood by the small mirror undoing the pins in her hair. He expected hesitation, shyness, perhaps even tears. What he did not expect was the steady way she turned to him, her dark eyes unflinching. "You think me weak," she said, her voice clear. "You think because I am soft and round that I will falter here. But you don't know the nights I've sat alone, the hunger I've endured, the shame I've borne. You don't know the fire in me." Jacob stared, stunned. The men in the saloon had called her a joke, a prize in a cruel game. Yet here she was, fierce as the prairie wind, her voice strong enough to silence every jeer that haunted her. And in that moment, Jacob Holt realized the truth. The bet had brought him to her door, but what stood before him now was no wager, no bargain, no burden. She was a woman forged by sorrow and courage, and she would change the course of his life in ways he had never imagined. The morning after their wedding, dawn came cold and pale over the Wyoming plains. Frost clung to the fence posts and the cattle lowed in the distance, their breath rising like smoke in the chill. Jacob Holt stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching against frozen earth, and drew a long breath of the bitter air. He was a man used to the silence of mornings like this, used to the endless rhythm of ranch life, but today something felt different. Today there was another presence inside his house. A woman who bore his name now, a woman who had stood before him the night before with unshakable fire in her eyes. Mary Ellen had risen early too, though not out of habit. Her nerves were sharp, her mind restless. She had spent half the night staring at the low rafters of the bedroom ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of a man's slow breathing beside her. It was not the soft comfort of her first marriage, where her husband had been gentle but distant, consumed by his business affairs. This was different. Jacob Holt radiated a kind of restrained power even in sleep, as though the land itself had molded him into something unyielding. She pulled on her shawl and began exploring the kitchen, running her hands over the rough-hewn table, the iron stove that bore the marks of long use, the shelves where jars of beans and flour sat neatly aligned. It was a house built by a man who valued order and necessity over beauty. Not a lace curtain, not a painted dish, only what was needed. Mary Ellen understood then that her presence here would be like tossing a flame into a cold hearth. Whether it caught and warmed the place or sputtered out depended on both of them. When Jacob returned from his morning round, dusted with frost, he found her kneading bread at the table. Her sleeves were rolled up, her cheeks flushed, her dark hair spilling loose from its pins. The sight startled him in a way he did not expect. For years, this house had been filled with nothing but the sound of his boots, his tools, the scrape of his chair. Now there was the rhythm of her hands on dough, the faint hum of a tune she carried in her throat without realizing it. "You're up early," he said gruffly. She glanced at him, a quick smile flickering across her lips. "Bread doesn't rise if you let it sleep in. Neither should a wife." He said nothing more, but his gaze lingered on her longer than he intended. Life on the ranch was harsh, and Mary Ellen learned quickly what it meant to be a rancher's wife. Jacob did not pamper her, nor did he coddle. He expected her to shoulder her share of the work, feeding chickens, mending fences, hauling water. At first her hands blistered, her body ached, and at night she collapsed into bed, too tired even to dream. But she did not complain. Each task became a quiet victory, proof to herself that she was not the fragile creature the town had painted her to be. The neighbors came sniffing soon enough. Mrs. Henderson, a sharp-tongued woman with a brood of children, rode up one afternoon under the pretense of delivering eggs. Her eyes roved over Mary Ellen, taking in the way her dress strained at the seams, The flush of her cheeks from work, the new calluses on her hands. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone syrupy with hidden barbs. "Looks like Mr. Holt finally found himself a helpmate. Brave of you, dear, coming all the way out here. This land can be mighty cruel on a delicate frame." Mary Ellen smiled sweetly, though her heart hammered. Delicate things survive when you least expect them. Prairie flowers bloom where nothing else will grow. Jacob, standing behind her, gave the faintest twitch of his lips, almost a smile. But not all visitors came with sly words. One day a stranger rode in from the east, lean and road-worn, his coat dusty and his eyes sharp. He introduced himself as Thomas Dillard, a drifter looking for work. Jacob eyed him cautiously, for men who wandered often carried more secrets than saddlebags. Mary Ellen, however, offered the man water and bread without hesitation. "A hungry man is twice as dangerous," she said quietly to Jacob. "Feed him and he might prove a friend." Thomas thanked her with a smile that lingered too long, a smile Jacob did not miss. He offered his back for ranch labor in exchange for meals, and, though Jacob mistrusted him, he agreed, for the herd was large, the fences long, and extra hands were always needed. That night, as the fire crackled, Jacob studied Mary Ellen across the table. She spoke with warmth to Thomas, asking about his travels, his stories of Texas plains and Colorado mines. Jacob said little, but his silence was not disinterest. It was something deeper, something unsettled. He realized with a start that he did not want her eyes shining for another man's words. Their marriage had begun as a bargain, but slowly, quietly, threads of something more began to weave between them. Jacob found himself noticing the way Mary Ellen's laughter softened the edges of a hard day, the way her determination never faltered even when she stumbled in mud or tore her dress on barbed wire. He saw her courage in small things, in facing down the gossip of neighbors, in tending to a sick calf with gentle hands and confronting him directly when he grew too withdrawn. And Mary Ellen, for her part, began to see the man beneath Jacob's stern exterior. He was not cruel, not cold as the town claimed. He was cautious, burdened by loneliness so deep it had carved grooves into his soul. When he thought no one was watching, she caught glimpses of tenderness. A hand resting on a horse's muzzle longer than needed, a careful way of setting down her sewing basket so it wouldn't topple, a quiet glance toward her when she laughed. Still, a shadow lay between them, the truth of the bet. Jacob had not confessed it, and each day that passed made the weight heavier on his chest. The turning point came one stormy evening. Thunder rolled low across the prairie and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. Rain pounded against the roof as Jacob and Mary Ellen struggled to close the barn doors before the wind tore them off their hinges. Soaked and breathless, they collapsed inside, straw clinging to their clothes, their faces lit only by flashes of stormlight. "You'll catch your death," Mary Ellen gasped, pushing wet hair from her face. "So will you," Jacob said, his voice rough. And then, as though the storm itself had cracked him open, the truth spilled out. "Mary, I married you on a bet. They mocked you in the saloon, called you weak. I was fool enough to take their challenge. I thought it wouldn't matter. I thought we'd both get what we needed. But now..." His words broke, thunder shaking the ground. Mary Ellen stared at him, her breath caught. Betrayal burned hot in her chest, sharper than any gossip, deeper than any jeer she'd endured. She had trusted him, built her hope on his steady presence, and now she saw it had been born of mockery. Yet as lightning lit his face, she saw no laughter there, only shame, raw and heavy like chains around his shoulders. Her voice trembled, but it did not falter. "So I was a wager, a joke. Tell me, Jacob Holt, do you still see me as a bet, or do you see me as your wife?" Silence roared louder than the thunder. Jacob's gray eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, his heart spoke with no walls, no armor. "I see you," he whispered, "and I've never seen anyone more." The storm raged on, but in the barn something shifted. The air between them burned with anger, hurt, but also something fierce and undeniable. Mary Ellen turned from him, torn between leaving him to his shame or standing by the truth that had been laid bare. She had come west for a new life, not for pity, not for ridicule. Could she bear to stay with a man who had bound her to him for sport? And Jacob, drenched and trembling, knew that the bet had not only risked his pride, it had risked the only chance at love he had ever been given. The storm that had battered the plains rolled east by dawn, leaving the land drenched and trembling as if it too had endured a night of confessions. Jacob Holt rose from his cot in the barn where he'd chosen to sleep, giving Mary Ellen space after his bitter admission. His body ached from rain-soaked labor, but it was nothing compared to the heaviness in his chest. He had told her the truth at last, that their marriage had begun as a cruel wager, and the memory of her eyes, blazing with hurt, burned hotter than any fever. He'd seen betrayal before, in neighbors who broke promises, in drifters who stole cattle, in men who shook hands only to draw knives later. But to see that look in Mary Ellen's eyes that had begun to trust him, to soften toward him, was more than he could bear. He stepped out into the muddy yard, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Cattle bawled restlessly. Chickens flapped from their roosts, and the ranch seemed to mock him with its stubborn pulse of life. How was he to carry on as if nothing had broken between them? Inside the house, Mary Ellen sat at the table, staring at the loaf of bread she had baked the day before. It lay untouched, a reminder of her effort to build something warm and good in this cold place. Jacob's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "I married you on a bet." She pressed her hands against her stomach, nausea twisting. She had endured whispers in town, endured the mockery of strangers, but to be mocked by the very man who had pledged her his name, that cut deeper than she'd imagined possible. And yet, she could not shake the memory of his face when he confessed. There had been no smugness, no cruel satisfaction, only shame, raw and unguarded. Men like Jacob Holt were not easy with words, not practiced in speeches. When he said, "I see you," she had heard truth in it, though it warred with the pain in her heart. The days that followed were thick with silence. Jacob threw himself into the work of the ranch, mending fences, hauling hay, tending the stock with a ferocity that left his hands raw. Mary Ellen kept to the house, scrubbing floors, baking bread she did not eat, sewing until her fingers bled. They spoke little, their words clipped and cautious, as if one wrong phrase might shatter what fragile thread still bound them. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Henderson passed by with her brood and remarked on the stiff air at the Holt ranch. Ezra Clanton, the very man who had spurred the bet, chuckled loudly in the saloon, boasting of how he'd made a fool of the widow and the rancher both. Whispers spread fast, reaching Mary Ellen's ears when she ventured to town for supplies. "Poor thing," the women whispered. "Married for a joke. Imagine the humiliation." Mary Ellen held her head high, but inside, humiliation gnawed like a wolf at her bones. One evening, when the weight of it grew too much, Mary Ellen stood at the doorway of the barn where tension simmered, but life on the frontier left little room for indulgence in wounds. Survival pressed hard upon them. A dry spell followed the storm, cracking the earth and thinning the creek. Cattle grew restless, their ribs showing. Jacob and Thomas Dillard, the drifter turned hand, worked long hours hauling water from distant springs. Mary Ellen, too, bore the strain. She rationed flour and beans, stretched meals thinner, and sewed patches into clothes already worn thin. Hunger gnawed at her, but she refused to complain. If anything, her resolve hardened. She would not be the weakling the town believed her to be. Yet the land was not the only threat. One evening, as Jacob returned late from the northern pasture, he found smoke rising from the ridge. When he crested the hill, his blood ran cold. A neighboring ranch had been raided, cattle stolen, barns torched, and the bodies of 2 men left in the dust. Outlaws. Blackthorn had always skirted the edge of lawlessness, its sheriff too old and too cautious to challenge the gangs that rode through. But now the raids were coming closer. Jacob returned home with his jaw set, his mind racing. Mary Ellen met him at the door, her face pale as he relayed what he had seen. "They'll come here," she whispered. Jacob nodded grimly. "We'll be ready." In the days that followed, the ranch became a fortress. Jacob reinforced doors, sharpened tools into weapons, and kept his rifle within arm's reach. Thomas patrolled the fence lines at night, eyes sharp for movement. Mary Ellen, though fear coiled in her belly, learned to load a shotgun. Jacob's large hands guided hers, steadying her aim, his breath warm against her cheek as he whispered instructions. Their closeness stirred something dangerous in her, an ache she had tried to bury under her hurt. Though she burned with betrayal, though doubt still gnawed, she could not deny the pull she felt when his hands brushed hers, when his eyes softened for her in moments he thought she did not see. Danger, it seemed, had a way of binding people tighter than comfort ever could. The attack came one moonless night. Mary Ellen woke to the sound of hooves pounding like thunder across the plains. Shouts tore the air, rough voices filled with menace. Jacob was already at the window, rifle in hand, his body taut with readiness. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Mary Ellen's fingers gripped the shotgun with white-knuckled resolve. Firelight flared outside as the outlaws torched the haystack. Cattle bawled in panic. Jacob fired into the night. The crack of his rifle answered by curses and return fire. Thomas shouted from the barn, steel flashing in the dark. Mary Ellen's heart hammered, but she held her ground. When a shadow loomed near the porch, she raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. The blast shook her to her core, the recoil slamming her shoulder, but the figure fell. Smoke, fire, and gunpowder thickened the air. Jacob fought like a man possessed, his fury pouring out in every shot, every movement. Mary Ellen, trembling, reloaded with shaking hands, her fear drowned by the knowledge that survival demanded courage. At last, the hoofbeats retreated, the shouts fading into the distance. The yard was a ruin, smoldering hay, trampled earth, blood staining the dust. Jacob lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Mary Ellen stood on the porch, the shotgun still in her hands, her face pale but unbroken. Their eyes met through the smoke, and something passed between them. Something raw, fierce, undeniable. She had not only defended the ranch, she had defended him. And in that moment, Jacob Holt knew he was no longer the lonely rancher who had taken a cruel bet. He was a man who had found his equal, a woman whose fire burned brighter than the scorn of the world. But victory brought no peace. The outlaws would return, hungrier than before, and the town's whispers would only grow darker. And as Mary Ellen nursed her bruised shoulder, she wondered if her heart could heal from a wound deeper than any bullet. The wound of betrayal and love entwined. The ranch smoldered for days after the raid. Burned hay left an acrid stench in the air. Charred fence posts leaned like blackened teeth, and the soil bore dark stains that rain could not wash away. Jacob Holt worked tirelessly, his muscles aching, his eyes hollow from nights spent pacing the fence line with his rifle. But beneath the grind of survival was something heavier. Guilt. Guilt that he had dragged Mary Ellen into this life. Guilt that she had stood on the porch with a shotgun because of him. Guilt that he had failed to protect her from both the outlaws outside and the truth inside. Mary Ellen, however, did not retreat into fear as some women might. Instead, she moved through the ruined yard with quiet determination, gathering what could be salvaged, baking with flour stretched thinner than ever, stitching torn blankets by lamplight. Her body bore bruises from the recoil of the gun, but her spirit seemed to grow sharper. She had looked death in the face and had not faltered. She told herself she should be proud. Yet when she lay awake at night, she could not silence the echo of Jacob's confession. "I married you on a bet." Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes heavy with unspoken words, and sometimes she found herself staring back, torn between the wound of betrayal and the undeniable pull of something deeper. Their bond was forged in fire and gunpowder now, but whether it would temper into steel or shatter like glass, neither of them knew. The town, of course, wasted no time in making their pain into gossip. When Mary Ellen went for supplies, whispers rose behind her like weeds. Heard the Holt place was attacked. They say the widow fired a gun herself. Poor thing, maybe she'd have been better off back east. Mary Ellen kept her chin high, but inside her chest burned. She wanted to shout that she was not weak, not foolish, not some tragic figure to be pitied. She wanted to tell them that she had stood her ground while others cowered. As if to test them, hardship came swiftly. The outlaws struck again, this time raiding the town itself. Blackthorn awoke to smoke, shattered windows, and the sheriff tied to a post in the square. Humiliated and beaten. It was a message clear as the desert sky. No one was safe, not the ranchers, not the townsfolk. Panic rippled through the people. Some spoke of leaving, packing wagons, and fleeing east. Others called for vengeance, their voices trembling with rage and fear. Jacob stood in the saloon, his hat shadowing his eyes, listening as men argued. "We can't fight them," one man said. "They're too many." "If we don't fight, we'll be picked off one by one," another spat. "And what of the sheriff? He can't even keep his own badge safe." Then Ezra Clanton, the same man whose bet had ruined Jacob's peace, stood and sneered. "Well, maybe our lonely rancher here ought to lead the charge. After all, he's the one with the brave wife. If she can shoot an outlaw, surely he can do better." Laughter spread, mean and sharp. Jacob's fists clenched, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, his voice cut through the noise, low and steady. "Laugh all you want, but I'll fight." "With or without you." The room fell silent. Jacob Holt was not a man who made boasts. His words carried weight, the kind that could not be ignored. When he returned home, Mary Ellen was waiting on the porch, the shotgun across her lap. The night air was cool, the stars sharp against the dark sky. She looked up at him, her face unreadable. "They'll come again," she said. He nodded. "They will. And when they do, we'll be ready." For a long moment they stood in silence, the distance between them slowly narrowing, not through words but through shared resolve. They had been thrown together by a cruel wager, torn apart by truth and scarred by violence. But the fire of survival, the fire of love half-born and half-denied, burned between them still. And as Jacob reached out, brushing his rough hand against hers, Mary Ellen did not pull away. The days after the second raid fell heavy over Blackthorn like a storm that refused to break. Townsfolk moved with fear etched into their faces. Doors barred early, lanterns snuffed out before dark. Every rider in the distance was a potential threat. Every creak of wood at night a cause for panic. But on the Holt Ranch, fear took on a different shape. It hardened into resolve. Jacob repaired what was broken. His broad shoulders bowed under the weight of labor and worry. Thomas kept the cattle close, his watchful eyes scanning the horizon for shadows. Mary Ellen, though weary, moved through the house like a force of her own. She mended clothes by candlelight, cooked what meager food was left, and learned the steady rhythm of loading cartridges into the shotgun until it felt as natural as kneading bread. The bond between her and Jacob grew in strange, uneven ways. They spoke little of feelings, but in the smallest moments, when he reached to lift the heavy pail before she could strain her arms, when she pressed a cloth against the scrape on his brow without flinching, something deeper unfolded. It was not romance born of flowers or poetry, but of survival, of grit, of standing shoulder to shoulder against a world that seemed determined to test them. Still, the wound of betrayal lingered. Mary Ellen could not forget the cruel bet, even as her heart softened toward the man who had confessed it. Jacob, for his part, bore that shame like a chain, each day hoping that his actions might prove what his words had failed to erase. One night, after a long day of hauling timber for new fences, Jacob returned to the house to find Mary Ellen by the window, staring out at the darkened prairie. The lamp burned low, casting her face in gold. "You're awake," he said quietly, setting his hat aside. She nodded, not turning. Hard to sleep when you're waiting for hooves in the night. Jacob moved closer, his voice softer than she was used to hearing. "They won't take this place, Mary. Not while I'm breathing." Her eyes flicked to him then, shining with something he couldn't quite read. "It's not the land I fear losing," she whispered. "It's what little I've built here. My place, my worth. Maybe even you." The word struck him harder than any outlaw's bullet. Before he could stop himself, his hand reached for hers. Her fingers trembled, but she did not pull away. For the first time since their hurried courthouse vows, Jacob bent his head and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was raw, desperate, filled with unspoken apologies and unyielding need. Mary Ellen responded not with hesitation, but with a fierceness that surprised them both. When they pulled apart, breathless, the silence between them was different, no longer heavy with shame, but fragile with possibility. The possibility was tested sooner than either expected. At dawn, Thomas rode hard into the yard, his horse lathered, his voice sharp with urgency. "They're coming. A dozen at least. Maybe more. They hit the Henderson place last night and left it smoking. We've got hours, maybe less." Jacob's jaw set, his hand already reaching for his rifle. "Then we'll be ready." Mary Ellen's heart pounded, but she did not falter. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and went to gather cartridges. This time she would not be left to watch. This time she would stand beside him, not behind. They set to work like soldiers preparing for war. Jacob and Thomas reinforced the barn, stacked crates as barricades and checked every weapon twice. Mary Ellen filled buckets with water, tore strips of cloth for bandages, and laid out what little food they could reach in case the fight dragged into the night. Jacob paused once, watching her move with steady determination, and something in his chest swelled with pride. This was no delicate flower, no fragile widow mocked by townsfolk. This was a woman of iron will, and she was his. The outlaws came as the sun dipped low, their silhouettes black against the horizon. A dozen riders at least, faces masked, guns glinting in the dying light. Their leader, a broad man with a scar carved across his cheek, rode at the front, his voice carrying across the open land. "Holt, you've made yourself a nuisance. We'll take your cattle, your land, and if you're fool enough to stand in the way, we'll take your life too." Jacob stood at the porch, rifle in hand, Mary Ellen at his side with the shotgun. Thomas crouched near the barn, ready. Jacob's voice rang steady, carrying over the wind. "You'll take nothing from me." The leader laughed, a harsh sound. Then you'll die with your fat little wife clinging to your skirts. Mary Ellen's blood ran hot. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and before Jacob could stop her, she fired. The blast cracked across the yard, and one of the outlaws tumbled from his horse. The battle began. Gunfire shattered the evening. Bullets struck wood and dirt, sparks flying. Jacob fired with deadly precision, each shot fueled by years of practice and the fury of a man. The smoke of battle lingered for days. The Holt ranch bore the scars of gunfire and fire. Fences shattered, barns splintered, earth blackened with the stains of violence. Yet amid the ruin there was life. Cattle still lowed in the distance. Chickens still pecked in the yard and inside the house. Mary Ellen tended to Jacob's wound with the steady hands of a woman who had faced death and chosen defiance. Jacob bore his injury with silence, as he did all things, but his eyes betrayed the storm within him. He had faced the outlaws and driven them back, but he knew it was not finished. The scarred leader, the man with cruelty in his voice and greed in his eyes, would not rest until the Holt ranch lay in ashes, and Jacob Holt was nothing but a name carved in stone. Mary Ellen knew it too. Though she stitched his brow and pressed cool cloths against his fevered skin, she could see the tension in his jaw, the restless twitch of his hands. He was a man waiting for the final reckoning, and she, once mocked as the fat young widow, no longer trembled at the thought. She had loaded her shotgun, fired her shots, stood her ground. She had seen men fall and had not faltered. If the reckoning came, she would meet it beside him, not behind. The town of Blackthorn stirred after the battle at the ranch. Men who had once mocked Jacob now spoke his name with respect. Women who had pitied Mary Ellen now whispered in awe of her courage. But not all voices were kind. Ezra Clanton, bitter and cruel, sneered louder than ever. "Don't be fooled," he spat in the saloon. "Holt's nothing but a fool who married for sport. And his wife? She's a wager-turned-weapon. What kind of man hides behind a woman's skirts?" The words carried, as such poison always does. Jacob heard them, and so did Mary Ellen. But where once her cheeks would have burned with humiliation, now her eyes hardened with resolve. "Let him laugh," she told Jacob one evening as they stood together on the porch. The prairie stretched endless and golden before them, the wind carrying the faint scent of sage. "We'll outlive his laughter." Jacob turned to her, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "Mary, you're stronger than any man I know." She smiled faintly, though her eyes shone with unshed tears. "And you are not the man I first thought you were. You're the man who stood when others cowered, the man who confessed when lies would have been easier. The man she faltered, breath-catching. "The man I've come to love in spite of everything." His breath left him like a blow. No woman had ever spoken such words to him, not in truth. He took her hand, rough and scarred, and pressed it to his lips. "Mary Ellen Holt, I swear if it takes my last breath, I'll prove worthy of that love." Their moment of peace was short-lived. Word came that the outlaws were gathering, rallying under the scarred leader's command. They had lost face in Blackthorn, and men like that did not forgive. They would come not just for cattle or coin, but for vengeance. The townsfolk, once fractured, now looked to Jacob for leadership. The sheriff, his pride broken, admitted as much. "Holt, you've got their respect. You faced them down and you lived. If anyone can lead us, it's you." Jacob did not want to be a leader. He wanted only to keep his land, his wife, his hard-won peace. But Mary Ellen, standing beside him, laid her hand on his arm. "You can't fight this alone. None of us can. If you stand, they'll stand with you. And if they stand with you, we can end this." Her voice gave him strength. He nodded once, his jaw set. "Then we'll end it." The final battle came at dawn. The outlaws thundered across the open plain, their numbers fierce, their voices raised in savage cries. But this time, they did not face a lone ranch. They faced Blackthorn itself, ranchers, farmers, townsfolk who had grown tired of fear. Rifles cracked from windows, pistols flared from behind wagons, and the people of Blackthorn fought as one. Jacob led from the front, his rifle steady, his eyes burning with resolve. Thomas fought at his side, swift and deadly. Mary Ellen, her heart pounding but her hands firm, took her place at the barricade, reloading with practiced ease, her shotgun firing into the fray. The scarred leader bellowed curses, cutting through the chaos like a storm. He drove his horse straight toward the Holt porch, gun raised, fury in his eyes. Jacob met him head-on, the two men colliding in a struggle fierce and brutal. Fists flew, guns clattered to the ground, and the world narrowed to blood and rage. Mary Ellen watched, her breath choking, as Jacob staggered under a blow. Without hesitation, she raised her shotgun and fired. The blast struck the outlaw square. throwing him from the saddle. Silence followed, broken only by the retreating hoofbeats of the few who survived. Blackthorn had won. The aftermath was a strange quiet. Bodies lay still, the air thick with smoke, but the town stood, the ranch stood, and Jacob Holt, bloodied but unbroken, stood beside his wife. As the townsfolk gathered, voices rising in relief and awe, Jacob turned to Mary Ellen. She looked at him, her cheeks streaked with soot, her hair tangled, her eyes fierce and shining. "You saved me," he whispered. "No," she said softly. "We saved each other." He pulled her close then, before all the town, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness he had long denied himself. And there, in the ashes of fear and the dawn of hard-won peace, Jacob Holt and Mary Ellen began anew, not as a wager, not as a joke, but as partners forged in fire, bound by love stronger than the whispers of men or the threats of outlaws. And when laughter came again, it was not cruel, not mocking, but joyous. The laughter of a man and woman who had defied the world and found each other in the wild heart of the West, ending line.